when the ASK people asked for, thank you, I'm constantly dropping, asked about specificities about my continuing to do something for ASK, I said, well, I would like to do the Kennedy's anti-narcotics policies from 61 through 63, and I said it's a rather long presentation. It's based on an even longer monograph. And they said, what? Which means they hadn't heard about it. But I convinced them that indeed it exists, though it is lost history. So they tried a number of people, and each time they said, who's doing this? And they said, what's he doing? And they didn't understand because it didn't exist. But they did call. I said, please call Peter Dale. So they called Peter Dale Scott. I said, would you be? He said, I'm very busy. Now, what is it? Who's doing this? And he said, Evica. And they could feel his interest rise. And he said, what's the topic? And they said, the Kennedy's anti-narcotics policies. He says, good, I'll be on the panel. I'll do guns. Unfortunately, as you know, Peter Dale is not here, and we regret not having him here. But I thought that was right on target, because I think I do not mention guns because it's a whole second infrastructure to this story. In 92 at ASK, I did a paper called Operations of Great Violence, Meyer Lansky, U.S. Intelligence, and the Drug Trade, which had followed an earlier paper, again, called Love Field, in which I keyed on to Jack Ruby's participation in and being a host at the restaurant meeting at Love Field, literally, where extraordinary people met who were involved in the handling of Sicilian and American laundered drug money in the pursuit of even more drugs and legitimate businesses. And that led me to a number of other things until I finally found this connection. In Operations of Great Violence, I said that Meyer Lansky had initiated, developed, and supported organized crimes drug operations from their inception and beyond the death of JFK. Lansky was in continuous contact with U.S. intelligence agencies, primarily because of a shared anti-communist orientation, including naval intelligence, the CIA, and the FBI. I think maybe there's a fourth now. Lansky and U.S. intelligence conspired to assassinate Fidel Castro, and both Lansky's associates and U.S. intelligence profited from the worldwide drug trade. I ended with a very long section that can be summarized this way inadequately. This shared interest in preserving heroin profits led directly to the death of John F. Kennedy. I'm trying to see if I can run this. Okay, I know what I'm doing here, I think. Let me see. Time on. Okay. Peter Dale Scott has always thought what we needed was a kind of catalyst to get at the synergy. That is, as I said to Lamar and to Tom, we've got H and we got O. We've got gases mixed, and no matter how much we shake the container, and they don't turn into water. What we need is a spark of electricity. That is the catalytic agent that transforms two gases into water. And I think I'm at least going to begin to provide it. This is from the Iron Sights, a work in progress which includes a monograph called This Monstrous Traffic, the Kennedy Administration's Anti-Narcotics Policies, 1961 through 1963. I think you know me. My name is George Michael Evica. I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of Hartford. I feel better speaking on my feet. Lamar and Tom will speak, they feel better seated. The author of And We Are All Mortal, and with a work in progress, sure. My ASK presentation, I said, is This Monstrous Traffic. On October 7th, 13th, and 21st, 1960, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates were held. Their outcome was clear. Republican candidate Richard Nixon was headed for defeat in the 1960 presidential election. In that same month of October 1960, Senator John F. Kennedy called for a major narcotics conference to examine drug abuse, the illicit narcotics traffic, and new and alternative programs for coping with a national disaster, the failed so-called war on drugs. The impact of JFK's call was also clear. As a member of the Senate and then as the Democratic candidate for the U.S. presidency, Kennedy had indicated his liberal, anti-colonialist, and globalist orientation, an orientation deeply disturbing to a powerful anti-communist nexus of right-wing political groups, high-ranking U.S. military officers, Pentagon procurement officials, powerful Washington lobbyists, civilian defense contract holders, and Southwest oil and gas millionaires. As a member of the Senate Rackets Committee, Senator Kennedy had targeted Jimmy Hoffa and his corrupt labor union confederation and major organized crime figures and their nationwide illegal operations. This working partnership of lawless labor and the syndicate was both anti-communist and conservative, highly suspicious of revolutionaries like Fidel Castro and of reformers like JFK. Having already attacked the intersecting empires of Jimmy Hoffa and Meyer Lansky, both heavily involved in narcotics and allied to U.S. intelligence, key military figures, and military procurement lobbyists, John F. Kennedy now threatened a terrible narcotics symbiosis, the domestic so-called drug war bureaucracy in the government, and the international narcotics industry. With Kennedy's call for a national narcotics conference, alarm bells rang for one, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and its supporting institutional structures, corrupt city and state police forces and penal systems. Two, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics' close working allies in the FBI, in the CIA, earlier in the OSS, in Pentagon, in Army and Navy intelligence, in U.S. corporations profiting from the narcotics trade and its laundered money, in the U.S. Congress, and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics network of anti-communist, anti-democratic, counterintelligence informants, many of them in the syndicate and in corrupt labor unions and complicit in both the national and international drug business. Senator Kennedy was echoing a major report on narcotics published in 1960 jointly by the American Medical Association and the American Bar Association, a book called Drug Addiction, Crime or Disease, defining the nation's narcotic crisis as a criminal problem, according to that report, was a total failure. Dr. Alfred Lindesmith, Indiana University sociology professor and longtime target of Harry Anslinger and the Bureau of Narcotics, was the author of the report's introduction, hailing the joint effort as, quote, a landmark in the history of the drug problem in this country, unquote. The long-standing policies of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the repressive laws upon which the FBN based its philosophy and action were now under direct attack. Before his assumption of the presidency in January of 1961, JFK had already decided to deal with and, if possible, solve the national narcotics problem, carrying with him into office the public sanction of two of the most influential professional bodies in the United States, the AMA and the ABA. Immediately upon assuming the presidency, John F. Kennedy and his Attorney General Robert Kennedy initiated a long-term campaign of administrative procedures and programs they believed would lead to dramatic and even revolutionary changes in the narcotics and dangerous drug policies of both the federal and states governments. That is, had John F. Kennedy lived. Every major proposal in the 1990s for eliminating the drug war, for reforming and humanizing U.S. drug laws, and for putting organized crime and its allies, including U.S. intelligence, out of the drug trade, every contemporary anti-narcotics proposal for dealing with the national failed war on drugs was already being presented by John F. Kennedy, by Robert Kennedy, and by Kennedy spokespersons both inside and outside the administration in 61, 62, and 63. Now, I know where you're thinking this is what I thought when I began this work, and I began to see it develop. This is history down the dark memory hole, right? Nothing of this in its totality exists in any history book you will pick up, nor in any history of the drug trade, nor even from the very best materials from the Drug Abuse Council of the United States. But John F. Kennedy was killed before he and his brother could put their new policies and programs into operation. Now, the narcotics program was quite extensive, and what I've tried to do is to develop how they orchestrated, and I can't do that in depth for you, who they cultivated and received into the structure from federal, state, and local sources across the United States, how they enlisted major figures in New York and California, how they got to with highly visible media commentary, their evolving program, and especially their deliberate exclusionary tactics directed especially at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, but also at blocking figures and groups in the FBI, the CIA, and among former officers and officials of the OSS supportive of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and on. The program is extraordinary in its intellectual and pragmatic union. But with the president's death, the powerful domestic forces opposing any changes in U.S. narcotics legislation and practice were back in control. Now let's back up again. Harry Anslinger was reappointed Commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics the same day the new president's brother was sworn in as Attorney General, but was scheduled for automatic retirement shortly after. Just as John F. Kennedy understood the nation's narcotics crisis was insoluble if the Bureau of Narcotics were allowed to define the narcotics problem, so also Robert Kennedy, as early as his tenure on the Rackets Committee, saw that the distributors of those narcotics, primarily the Syndicate Teamsters Alliance domestically, could not be eliminated without the, quote, pooling of intelligence through a National Crime Commission, unquote. That was Robert Kennedy's plan. He developed it in 59-60. But as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy found J. Edgar Hoover stonewalling on such a super agency. So RFK brought Douglas Dillon, Mortimer Kaplan, that was a new man in IRS, and J. Edgar Hoover together, literally in one room, and with a more modest proposal, which was to pool criminal intelligence inside the Justice Department, and he got Hoover's consent. But the task of coordinating that information was then given by RFK to the newly established organized crime section of the Justice Department rather than to Hoover's FBI. Douglas Dillon, new Secretary of the Treasury, and Robert Kennedy, new Attorney General, early became close friends and mutual admirers. A close person to both of them said, no two people became closer friends in the next 3 years than Dillon and RFK. Now, with the Treasury's top administrator, despite all his elitist background, his banking connections, and his Eisenhower administration credentials, and his mixed Democratic and Republican credentials back to the Roosevelt administration, Douglas Dillon, as Treasury's top administrator, became a loyal supporter of RFK's anti-narcotics policies. The Attorney General then called a conference of top officers of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, including Anslinger, gave, according to Anslinger, a, quote, inspiring, unquote, speech, and publicly called before the agents who worked for Anslinger to cooperate in a drive against the syndicate and its narcotics trafficking. Robert Kennedy took over the actual direction of the Bureau of Narcotics from Anslinger, bypassing the commissioner and his top assistants by going directly to the Bureau's agents. Direct quote from RFK, "I got the Bureau of Narcotics." Within 1 month of JFK taking office, every federal investigatory and law enforcement agency with some interest or jurisdiction in narcotics was cooperating in making major drug trafficking interceptions, arrests, and convictions. City and state police departments sympathetic to the Kennedys' new drive against drugs joined in the attack. Attorney General Robert Kennedy forced cooperation between these units, often inclined to hide their best and sometimes most embarrassing evidence from other units. It's incredible. The FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, Treasury, the Federal Narcotics Bureau, Treasury, Securities and Exchange Commission cooperated. He got their investigative unit as never before. There was no doubt about who was boss. For none, as Mullenhoff in Strikeforce says, for none could come between the Attorney General, gets poetic there, and his brother, the President. This ad hoc unification of investigating and policing agencies and offices was, I believe, the origin of the idea that JFK was to place Robert Kennedy at the head of the CIA. Rather, RFK's bringing together of these forces in an anti-drug trafficking combination, targeting Teamsters and syndicate operations, threatened those individuals and those operations of the CIA and earlier in the OSS complicit in the protection of or involved directly in narcotics trafficking. During his McClellan Rackets Committee tenure, Robert Kennedy had discovered the matrix of relations between organized crime, corrupt labor, the syndicate's race wire and its gambling network, and other lucrative endeavors, principally narcotics traffic. In RFK's first year as Attorney General, directing this collaborative Kennedy administration attack on the traffic, the New York Times reported 12 major strikes within 10 months against narcotics operators. By the way, these arrests were not ordinary street busts. There were thousands of street busts. In a way, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics kept up its statistical record with those street busts. No, these were 12 major strikes in 10 months. The illegal drug trafficking distribution network itself was under direct attack, and that attack was being led by U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy. April 27, 1961, two New Jersey House Democrats offer a resolution to the House of Representatives calling for a presidential conference on narcotics. They're on a roll. That same week, April 1961, the Joint American Association and American Medical Association Committee report that I spoke about earlier, Drug Addiction, Crime or Disease, is now being published by Indiana University Press with an advance sale of 1,250 copies, which is quite large for a university press book in 61, and come to think of it, it's quite large for a university press book in 1994. Researched and written in 59, the report subsequently had a very small circulation. But in 61, it's resurrected, published by a major university press, possibly arranged, I think, I can follow it, by Robert Kennedy through Dr. Alfred Lindesmith again, who is in the Department of Sociology then at Indiana University and who wrote the original introduction. This report urged, quote, a thorough review of federal narcotics policies and argued, watch the careful language here, that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had unwittingly supported both narcotics addiction and narcotics traffic by defining addicts as criminals, unquote. The ABA-AMA report was characterized by the New York Times as, quote, one of the strongest attacks ever made on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Agency and the views of its director, Harry Anslinger. Director Harry Anslinger sent FBN agent Edward R. Cass to the offices of Indiana University Press, he scowled all the time, to investigate. Cass wanted to know who had financed the report's publication by this press. And why had the press published the report just at this time? Anslinger's FBN investigation of a university press suggested strongly the director suspected the Kennedys were working against him and his bureau through Indiana University Press. In turn, Anslinger and his Federal Bureau of Narcotics were publicly perceived by the Kennedy administration as major obstacles to rationalizing and transforming U.S. narcotics policies. On June 22, 1961, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics struck back. FBN District Supervisor George Gaffney, who, by the way, has a whole history of his own, urged the impeachment, the immediate impeachment of judges who disregarded so-called mandatory narcotic sentences. You have to know, by the way, by the beginning of 1961, the federal judiciary moves in behind the Kennedys, so that the federal judiciary is in support of what ultimately will be a remarkable revolution in narcotics policy. So the FBN then goes after the federal judges. The Senate Rackets Committee had earlier discovered that organized crime's communications network, based on its racing wire, was vital to the syndicate's survival. Now supported by the president and his brother, the attorney general, and the Senate's so-called gambling hearings, those were on in late August and early September of 61, run by Senator John L. McClellan. They investigated this structure in depth, eventually linking the syndicate's betting, communications, and financial structure with its narcotic operations. Immediately following these hearings, and by the way, I have to go right by them, they're very important, but I have to go right by them, the gambling investigations and hearings, Senate investigators spread out across Europe, collecting data on the syndicate's narcotics trade for a further set of hearings. The FBN was apparently left out of the investigation. On January 21st, 62, syndicate drug Lord Lucky Luciano, who had cooperated with naval intelligence, the OSS, and now, as far as I can see, I may have important leads, possibly with the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in Europe, died in Naples just before his imminent arrest. So we lost an important link there in history. The support for the Kennedys' proposed changes in the attempt to solve the narcotics problems surfaced early in '62. Coming, for example, in February, Mayor Wagner called for certain, not simply dramatic changes, but revolutionary changes, a comprehensive attack on both trafficking and addiction. Apparently, Wagner had agreed both in his own political interests and in the interests of the city to be a conduit for the Kennedy administration's reformation of U.S. narcotics policies. March 14th, 1962, President Kennedy's consumer message to Congress reaffirmed his Attorney General's commitment to policing illegal traffic, not just in narcotics, so-called narcotics, but so-called legal drugs, now to be called dangerous drugs, calling for close enforcement. After a meeting with RFK in Washington in early April, Mayor Wagner said that Attorney General Robert Kennedy was, quote, receptive, unquote, to a White House-sponsored narcotics conference. As far as I can see, it's already being planned. The Kennedy agenda is picking up momentum. April 16, 1962, Mayor Wagner holds a national narcotics conference in New York, attended by local, state, federal experts and officials. They call for new laws, new authority, and they publicly request the Attorney General of the United States to make wiretapping of suspected major traffickers legal. Finally, the New York conference calls for a national narcotics conference in Washington to further explore the key issues. I remember, if you have never heard this before, and I never read any of this before, it's because I think there's been a very deliberate attempt to eliminate this from the history of the nation. Throughout the first 6 months of '62, news of and announcements about new hospitals, new rehabilitation programs, more humane sentencing procedures, calls for further federal action poured out of New York City and out of Albany. In Washington, the Kennedys enlisted such conservative support figures as Senator Thomas Dodd and Senator Kenneth Keating, whose bill to offer medical treatment to addicts arrested for violation of federal crimes with the hope of dismissing their sentences if they completed the rehabilitation program was enthusiastically endorsed on April 30th, '62 by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department. The Kennedy program, now preparing for that narcotics conference of September '62, received a massive boost from the United States Supreme Court on June 26, 1962. The Supreme Court of the United States found in a 6-2 decision that the California law making addiction a criminal offense was unconstitutional, a violation of the 8th Amendment. With the decriminalization of drug addiction, which is precisely what that's about, the way was open for the Kennedys to press their case for returning so-called drug abuse cases to where they belonged, to the medical profession. On July 29, '62, another major text from the American Bar Foundation, Narcotics and the Law. This, again, let me just summarize it for you, calls for massive cooperative effort to unite legislators, doctors, medical researchers, and law enforcement officials, sounding remarkably like the developing Kennedy program. Well, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics has a counterattack, 4 counterattacks led by Anslinger and Saragusa, and it's very interesting. They constitute a series of false explanations. Their explanations can be summarized maybe in 2 sentences. The real drug problem is that Communist China and Castro Cuba are sending in drugs which are developed by the mafia inside the United States to demoralize the country. Now, if that Chinese-Cuban conspiracy sounds like a later explanation for another event, the assassination, I think you're not too far off in seeing that both of them come from the same source. By the way, the only time they did have evidence of Cuban participation, times May 11th and June 2nd, 1962, the available evidence indicated anti-Castro Cubans were involved. By July '62, the FBN was under serious attack. Anslinger was no longer its boss. The Kennedy administration had accepted his retirement. moving Anslinger out, making him U.S. representative to the UN anti-narcotics meetings. New FBN Commissioner Giordano was an experienced FBN officer with a more narrow power base than Anslinger's, and therefore less threatening to the Kennedys. But Giordano was another, now documented, CIA ally. July 9, 1962, Giordano reported his support for Anslinger, but the New York Times, happy now to be attacking what looked like a sinking ship, backed the Kennedy administration, advocating a shift from focus on addiction to narcotics therapy. August 6, 1962, President John F. Kennedy announced that his administration would host a White House conference on narcotic and drug abuse to take place September 27, 28, 1962. In the 19 months from January 61 through July 62, Attorney General Robert Kennedy succeeded in arresting and convicting dozens and dozens of top drug traffickers and their associates. You need to look at the Attorney General report 61, 62, 63, and 64, which is in any Federal Registry library. Both California and New York were examining bold new narcotics reform programs. Influential figures across the United States in medicine, in criminology, in penology, in psychology, in sociology, and in government at the local and state and federal levels were persistently calling for major changes in the national anti-narcotics system, all led by the President himself. Given that 19-month pattern, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, its allies in U.S. intelligence, the syndicate, the Teamsters, and corporate profiteers in drugs and money laundering could predict what to expect from a national anti-narcotics conference sponsored by John and Robert Kennedy. Now, to prepare for that conference, the President established a presidential commission, the ad hoc panel on drug abuse, to study and report on the narcotics crisis in the United States. That was, as far as I can see, though, that was sent to the President. There exists, at least not in print that I could find, any separate edition of the ad hoc panel on drug abuse. It happens to be the last section of the printed proceedings. Now, this is a government document. Proceedings, White House Conference on Narcotic and Drug Abuse. It's a rather rare, important one, but again, go to your Federal Registry. They will frown because they probably think no such thing exists, but they'll find it for you. Proceedings of the White House Conference on Narcotic and Drug Abuse, September 27, 28, 1962. Every one of these documents is an historic document and points toward Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963. The ad hoc committee prepared a remarkable, I think at the very least reformist, if not revolutionary document, and it was in the hands of the 400 attendees from across the country, very prestigious and influential people in a new and revolutionary direction in our anti-narcotics.
Could you repeat the title of that?
Yes, Proceedings, White House Conference on Narcotic and Drug Abuse. All right? September 62. You can use the date, you can use White House, you can use narcotic, and it'll come up on a Federal Registry CD-ROM. The crucial research suggestions and action-oriented conclusions of that panel gave concrete direction to the White House, to the Presidential Commission that would be appointed afterward, to both the interim and final reports of still another Presidential Commission. That ad hoc panel then had begun a process of development of the administration's narcotic policies and programs that would lead the government through the first week of November 63. It delivered its groundbreaking medical report to the President the first week in September of 62, and the report was duplicated and sent to all of the participants, as I said. On September 16th and 17th, the New York Times reported on the ad hoc report. The warning bells continued to ring for the Bureau of Narcotics and its intelligence, syndicate, corrupt labor, informant, and military corporate allies. On July 5th, 62, President Kennedy accepted Harry Anslinger's resignation. The Kennedys now proceeded with their plan to dismantle the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and I can prove that, and substitute for its narcotics bureaucracy and for its protected major traffickers, 1, a national research-driven medical program, 2, an enlightened reform of the national narcotic and drug abuse laws, 3, a coordinated intelligence and law enforcement drive against the major organized crime narcotics producers and distributors. The next major step, the Kennedy Plan, a Kennedy-sponsored and Kennedy-organized first national conference on narcotic and drug abuse. Anslinger and Giordano were only allowed circumscribed statements. The organizers of the Kennedy agenda then broke loose. For 2 mornings, 2 afternoons, and 2 evenings, speaker after speaker supported the new Kennedy anti-narcotics vision. Throughout the conference, paper after paper emphasized that, quote, the drug abuse problem extends beyond narcotics, unquote. Just for example, Thursday, September 27, 1963, quote, current and experimental methods of treatment, unquote, were discussed. Research was examined, and late that afternoon, Dr. Lindesmith, that's the 3rd time you've heard his name, a remarkably heroic man, long a foe of the Bureau of Narcotics, argued that the smoking of dried hemp leaves, pot, was trivial, opening up a future Kennedy administration discussion of the decriminalization of marijuana. On Friday morning, September 28, 1962, civil commitment and parole was discussed. On that Friday afternoon, Robert Kennedy and Senator Thomas Dodd together strongly argued for the elimination of severe and mandatory drug sentencing. Dozens of judges on the state and federal level, federal criminal prison officials, medical experts presented eloquent arguments in support of the Kennedy administration's reform program. The Kennedys swept the field. Extraordinary document. Conference Planning Director Dean F. Markham concluded, quote, the first White House conference on narcotic and drug abuse is the beginning of a new, vital, and concerned effort to control the problem, unquote. In order to continue, there must be a focal point of coordination. To this end, the President is establishing at the White House level a commission. The commission's goal to expand, interpret, and recommend methods of implementing the ideas which you, the attendees, have brought to this meeting, unquote. Few presidentially sponsored programs were more heavily covered than by print, radio, and television media than this White House conference on transforming the country's narcotics and drugs agenda. 80 news organizations in all the media filed or broadcast stories on the conference. On January 15, 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed Presidential Executive Order 11076. Please remember that. Executive Order 11076. That presidential executive order created the Presidential Advisory Commission on Narcotic and Drug Abuse, an official body of the administrative branch of the government of the United States. I'll sometimes call that PACNDA, P-A-C-N-D-A, or the Prettyman Commission. PACNDA is just the acronym for it, and Prettyman Commission is the few times you might find it in print. It's called after its commission's chair. You may have heard other commissions named by their chair. This Kennedy Advisory Commission had the same legal status as, for example, a later presidentially commissioned panel popularly called the Warren Commission. PACNDA was headed by Judge E. Barrett Prettyman. The chair and 6 members were quite distinguished and knowledgeable. JFK's executive order requested the commission to recommend an anti-narcotics and drug abuse program to prevent the abuse of drugs and provide appropriate rehabilitation. 2, review and evaluate all the programs and operations of every federal agency presently involved in law enforcement functions or having statutory responsibilities. By the way, that opened up the door to examine Treasury and in their Federal Bureau of Narcotics by Presidential Commission Executive Order. And 3, to recommend improving the effectiveness of such programs and operations. To establish the unquestioned legitimacy of the Prettyman Commission and its presidential sanction, President Kennedy met with the commission in a carefully reported briefing at the White House in late January of '63. The commission then began an intensive 3-month investigation into the national narcotics crisis. Attorney General Robert Kennedy's coordinated attack on the narcotics traffickers registered significant syndicate and teamsters, arrests, indictments, and convictions throughout 1963. And growing support for the Kennedy administration's anti-narcotics program made year-long media news. For example, if you check the New York Times, major news stories on May 23rd, May 30th, June 2nd, June 4th, June 11th, June 20th, September 12th, September 14th, and November 21st. On March 15, 1963, with the backing of the Kennedy administration, the Senate, First Session, 88th Congress, passed Resolution 17, authorizing an organized crime and narcotics investigation and series of hearings to be chaired by the Kennedys' old friend from their work together on the Rackets Committee, Senator John L. McClellan. With John F. Kennedy in the White House and Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, now running a major concerted attack on narcotics traffickers utilizing the Justice Department, its criminal division, the Treasury Department, the Treasury's Bureau of Narcotics, the Treasury's IRS Intelligence Division, its Customs Section, and several other investigatory bodies, all united under Robert Kennedy, Securities and Exchange, as I suggested, the Kennedy program to transform the national anti-narcotics policies and programs, which already had the strong support from the judicial branch of the federal government, including the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, now had enlisted the Senate, part of the legislative branch of the federal government. On April 1st, 1963, the President's Advisory Commission delivered its interim report to President John F. Kennedy. The report was revolutionary. The Commission urged, 1, increased attacks on syndicate narcotics importers and distributors, 2, rehabilitation for narcotics and drug abusers as opposed to mandatory sentencing and imprisonment, and 3, significantly lighter sentences for street pushers and narcotics victims, recommending instead that narcotics wholesalers be targeted. The Prettyman Commission had delivered to President John F. Kennedy the most important administration-backed examination of narcotic and drug abuse in 100 years. The White House alerted the media. President John F. Kennedy announced his full endorsement of every one of the Prettyman Commission's recommendations, pledging that all federal agencies concerned with the drug crisis would study the report and cooperate with the Commission. It made front page, the New York Times, and across the United States. Simultaneously, on April 5th, 1963, the same day that JFK was hailing the Commission's findings, the highly regarded New York Academy of Medicine publicly called for the Bureau of Narcotics to get out of the practice of medicine. Again, the New York Times made it front page news, so you had 2 stories simultaneous. The President wholly endorses what is in effect the dismantling of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and over here, the New York Academy of Medicine is telling the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to get out of the practice of medicine. Same front page. The Academy echoed the Kennedy's continuing argument with the Bureau. George Gaffney launched a counterattack, disputed the Academy of Medicine. New York Times retaliated, supporting the Kennedy New York Academy stand. Still further, the report of the proceedings of the White House Conference on Narcotic and Drug Abuse became available from the government printing office on April 5th, 1963. You don't see a concerted attack operating right on April 5th, 1963. You can't see one. Was distributed nationally to Federal Registry libraries the second week of April 63. For example, I have the State Library in Hartford, Connecticut received their copy on April 11th, 1963. In one volume, 2 major White House-backed documents detailed the Kennedy administration's planned changes, in the country's anti-narcotics programs and policies. Therefore, in the first 2 weeks of April 1963, the Kennedy administration had scored 3 major hits against the FBN, against its narcotics bureaucracy, against its network of protected narcotics dealers, against their syndicate supporters, against their U.S. intelligence allies. The bells again were tolling, the ominous news for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and its narcotics nexus. The Kennedy administration left no doubt about its intentions. They were summarized, in fact, in Robert Kennedy's Attorney General's report for 1963, written, of course, before his brother died, discussing the President's Advisory Commission's findings. The official report of the Attorney General of the United States on narcotics drugs, 1963. The President's Advisory Commission on Narcotic and Drug Abuse issued in April of '63 a preliminary report of great discernment, great value, great usefulness. It recommended the abandonment of the present purely punitive approach to the narcotics problem and urged that instead the federal government adopt a broad program of research enforcement aimed at the major racketeers, more regulation of habit-forming drugs, the rehabilitative treatment of addicts, and more coordination of federal and state efforts to control the drug traffic. We, that is, the Justice Department of the United States, we heartily endorse all these recommendations as a constructive approach and one which promises of taking the profit out of smuggling and peddling of drugs, which at bottom, significant transferring from gambling and other racketeers to drugs, which at bottom has been the juice on which the gangsters and racketeers have built their empires. It's time we dried up the market by curing the addicts. I believe the less than 4 weeks between March 17th and April 11th, in fact, fixed JFK's fate. From Senator Kennedy's announcement of the need for a national conference, through that coordinated attack led by the Attorney General, the support of the AMA, the ABA, the gambling hearings, the ad hoc panel report, the White House conference, the compelling evidence mounted. Now in the spring of '63, the catalytic events leading to the assassination occurred. Those April 5th hits on the FBN and its entire structure. The newest recommendations of the President's official Prettyman Commission signaled that Kennedys would not turn back on their announced commitment. The narcotics cartel, its intelligence support, and all its allies were in mortal danger from the Kennedys. Whether prompted by the Kennedys or arrived at independently, the Prettyman Commission, remember, by executive order, an official commission of the President of the United States, the Prettyman Commission's decision was to dismantle the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and transfer its entire enforcement functions to the Justice Department to be totally controlled by the then Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. This recommendation was basic to their final report dated November 1st, 1963. Another marvelous document in your Federal Registry library. In September of '63, the Treasury Department, not the Bureau, the Treasury Department announced new rules, probably Dillon said, these are the rules, for interpreting U.S. anti-narcotics legislation, bringing the Bureau of Narcotics in line with the Kennedy administration. Following 4 months of intense trench warfare in the struggle against narcotics, the Kennedy administration opened a second front in late September of '63. Again, I can only tell you it is extraordinarily important. Organized crime and illicit traffic in narcotics, they controlled the entire hearings, two-part structure. Part one was to deal with, and now see, the FBN could call it the mafia, and the FBI could call it really bad Italian, La Cosa Nostra, right? The our thing. And the RFK and the Justice Department could call it the syndicate. By whatever name, RFK had gotten agreement among all these people that whatever you called it, it was responsible for the narcotics traffic. And now these hearings with their two-phase structure, one, they would go after the wholesalers and distributors, and then the second part, they would go after the specific narcotics traffic. In fact, RFK indicated that he was most interested in what was called in the introductory material, the mafia's so-called associated non-members, all right, including Meyer Lansky and the Lansky Group, which was to be a major RFK target after the '64 election. Phase two was to take up, as I said, criminal operations. Remarkable set of hearings. They were interrupted on October 16, 1963. 20 defendants in New York, up on drug charges, asked for indefinite postponement. That was reported on October 6, 1963. Subsequently, by the way, 11 were convicted. The open narcotics hearings were then suspended after the end of the October 16th session. The committee did hear Joe Valachi again in closed executive session. By the way, I have enough on Valachi to take up another hour, so I'm not ignoring him. The committee did hear him in closed executive session, 48 hours before the delivery of this extraordinary document on November 1st, 1963. Remember also that this was delivered on the very day and set on the President's desk on the day that the President apparently received word that President Diem was assassinated, reportedly unhinging President Kennedy. The narcotics hearings had been broken in two, announced as delayed only temporarily. The most crucial second phase on organized crime narcotics traffic was to open at the end of that trial. But before the hearings could be reconvened, another major part of the narcotics drive to reform the country's anti-narcotics policies and programs, President John F. Kennedy was killed in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. When John F. Kennedy was declared dead in Parkland Memorial Hospital on November 22nd, Robert Kennedy was no longer in control of the Kennedy administration's narcotics reformation program. With the president dead, his administration was forced to disband, his programs at best on hold. On March 11, 1964, Robert Kennedy announced he would resign as Attorney General no later than November of 1964. The narcotics hearings resumed on July 28, 1964, after that announcement. But they were no longer part of the Kennedy administration's anti-narcotics grand design. There were witnesses still loyal to the Kennedys. They did appear. There was still in their hearts and in their what they said a plan to put the Bureau of Narcotics out of business, and they were able to testify. But the opening witnesses in July of 1964 were Giordano and Anslinger in support of the FBN. The Kennedy anti-narcotics program was finished. The combined indifference of the committee chair, Senator McClellan, and the open hostility of the committee's general counsel left nothing of the previously orchestrated Kennedy plan intact. Now about the final report. The President's advisory commission's report wasn't a word revolutionary. It synthesized and organized 3 full years of orchestrated Kennedy administration anti-narcotics policies. It was absolutely remarkable. It had 7 distinguished members. It had 11 staff members headed by Dean Markham from the Special Projects staff of the White House. It had 5 interdepartmental liaisons from State, Treasury, Defense, Justice, and HEW. It had 80 eminent consultants and advisors it had used to develop the report. The Commission made 25 recommendations. I'll blow the horn on the ones I think are absolutely revolutionary and at the same time lead to the death a few blocks away. The Commission made 25 recommendations. I've organized them so we can hear them very quickly. The Commission recommended that a presidential aggressive action directive be issued immediately to all federal executives to join the administration's drive against narcotics and dangerous drugs. That a special assistant for narcotic and drug abuse have coordinating authority and responsibility, the equivalent, by the way, of a new cabinet-level executive position in the war against drugs in the Kennedy administration. That a Citizens Advisory Committee be created for review and recommendation. That the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare be given major unified responsibilities, National Development and Distributing Center, Center of a National Reporting System on Narcotics and Drug Abuse, and a National Testing Center to establish the safety of all available, possibly psychotoxic narcotics and drugs. That a permanent comprehensive research plan covering all aspects of abuse be established and funded by the federal government, and on an international level, several other important things. The federal government supports state, cities, and private institutions in development, treatment, and rehabilitation centers locally, but that the federal government, there are another couple of agencies that are not going to like this one, that the federal government close down its own extensive so-called public treatment programs and limits its activities to research only. In line with that, to begin to close down the federal program, the federal hospitals in Lexington, Kentucky and Fort Worth, Texas will be closed down. They will stop all of their operations and accept only, quote, voluntary patients for purposes of research, study. A special treatment program be established within the Bureau of Federal Prisons. A federal commitment statute be passed. Legitimate medical use of narcotics and medical treatment of narcotics be determined by the medical profession, confirmed by the amendment of federal law. Here comes one of the biggies. The functions of the Bureau of Narcotics relating to the regulation of legitimate transport of narcotic drugs and marijuana be transferred out of Treasury and out of the FBN to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And then a new HEW unit assigned to safety testing will then regulate this area. Here comes another one. The investigation of illegal trafficking in dangerous drugs be transferred totally from HEW to the Department of Justice. Legislation was then needed, a massive new educational program was to be funded, and a biggie. Robert Graves quoted another poet saying they really knew when a poem was great when the hair on the back of their head stood up, and Graves said it also worked for his whiskers when he shaved. If he read a poem and he could shave better, it meant the hairs on his face were standing up straight, and he got an easier shape out of good poetry. In the reading of the report, I had that kind of experience. Here it comes. All investigative functions of the Bureau of Narcotics relating to the illicit manufacture, sale, or other distribution or possession of narcotic drugs and marijuana be transferred from the Department of the Treasury and its Bureau of Narcotics to the Department of Justice. In order for Justice to perform these duties, there will be an all new federal enforcement personnel development. The 25 recommendations defined the Kennedy agenda in its reformation of the nation's anti-narcotics program. Obviously, it included the total dismantling of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. All of the FBN's investigatory and law enforcement functions would reside in the Justice Department. The Prettyman Commission left no doubt about the projected dissolution of the Bureau of Narcotics. On November 29, 1963, President Johnson appointed the members of his Presidential Commission, Warren Commission. December 5th, the Warren Commission held its first meeting, 2 hours, 45 minutes. They talked about news leaks and a handful of research projects. December 9th, U.S. Acting Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, in effect the acting Attorney General, wrote the Warren Commission, recommended that it issue immediately a statement that the FBI report, now complete, showed without doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was a loner. On December 13, 63, joint resolution of Congress gave the Warren Commission subpoena and other judicial authority. The Warren Commission met several times again in December. Especially significant was a 28 meeting where Howard Willens set up the investigative structure, a proposed structure already accepting the argument that Oswald was the assassin. On January 21st, the Warren Commission decided to hold closed sessions. On January 22nd, the Warren Commission met to discuss possible U.S. Oswald intelligence links. Got back to that on January 27th. In the midst of all this initial Warren Commission action, on January 25th, the official report of the President's Advisory Commission on Narcotic and Drug Abuse, withheld since the death of John F. Kennedy, was released. Apparently the Commission had again sent its report to the President, but this time it was President Johnson, sometime after November 22nd, asking for the new President's support of John F. Kennedy's revolutionary program. The White House was constrained to respond. According to the New York Times, the report was released to the press by the Johnson White House without comment. Press Secretary Pierre Salinger said, remember that executive order that I gave you? Press Secretary Pierre Salinger said he did not know LBJ's intentions. Salinger stated, this is a citizen's report. We're just making it public. We're not going to have any comment on it. That statement, as reported by Salinger, is blatantly untrue. The President's Advisory Commission had been created by presidential executive order, staffed by White House Special Projects Section. By the way, the White House also said the Justice Department turned a cold shoulder. No, we don't want to incorporate the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. That's been recommended before. We don't want to do that. It's an excellent operation. I was shocked, but don't be shocked for any moment more, because it was Katzenbach or his spokesperson who made that announcement. And the only recommendations for incorporation were the Kennedy administration itself. What about Robert Kennedy? Why did he say, hey, wait a minute? They chose a moment when Robert Kennedy was not only not in Washington, but not even in the United States. LBJ had asked RFK to visit Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines to mediate a so-called Indonesian-Malaysian dispute. RFK left the United States on January 20th. He was involved in the mediation through the 24th, expecting to arrive in London on the 24th. Unexpectedly, RFK was delayed when the U.S. Air Force plane taking him to London was reportedly forced to land at Évreux-Fauville U.S. Air Force Base, 60 miles west of Paris, for refueling. On January 25th, then, crucial date, The day that Johnson dismissed the Kennedy administration's Advisory Commission report, Robert Kennedy was in London late and expected to be there through January 28th. The chief sponsor and action officer of the Kennedy's anti-narcotics program had been conveniently sent out of the country by the new president. What the Times did, by the way, it was said that, well, you know, the FBN's been under fire by judges and the New York Academy of Medicine. Now, that's the beginning of the revision of U.S. history, because it ignored the very history that it itself had published for 3 years, heavily publicized reform programs promoted by the Kennedys. With the Warren Commission, by the way, only beginning its deliberations 1 day later, January 26, 1964, the day after Johnson White House rejects a 3-year program of revolutionary support for reform of the narcotics programs in the United States, a lone front-page article in New York Times reports that all the outstanding JFK assassination questions have now been answered. Remarkable. Some members of the Prettyman Commission, though, tried heroically to make and they did get into the news, probably not making very many friends, when they said they're still backing 100% dismantling of their narcotics bureau. Who killed JFK? Sometime between March 17th and April 11th, 1963, I believe a decision was made to murder John F. Kennedy. The catalyst was certainly the President's Advisory Commission interim report of April 1963, calling for the dismantling of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The November 1st, 63 final report confirmed that plan, threatening to expose the entire narcotics nexus, all its intelligence and syndicate support, all its anti-communist and corporate support, and all their dirty secrets. I think by April 23rd, 1963, the decision to bring JFK to Texas was obviously announced. Following that decision, the Kennedys planned for a reformation of the nation's anti-narcotics programs. The Kennedy response to that reformation plan are, I believe, the specific institutional contexts for the answer to the question, who killed JFK? That answer is, I believe, the managers of the international narcotics traffic and their organized crime, U.S. intelligence, and anti-communist network associates. They're the ones who murdered President John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. Thank you. It's my extreme pleasure. As I told you, I feel better standing up, and my colleagues I have much better sense. They stand down or sit. We're going to hear next from Tom Hartman, the author of over 200 articles published in magazines and newspapers ranging from the Christian Science Monitor to IBW, International Business Week, earned the Jesse H. Neal Award for Excellence in Reporting, has 3 nonfiction books currently in the stores, and one of his books was featured in Time magazine just this year. Has worked in radio and television news for 7 years, a reporter, anchor person, news director, and while doing book research, became a licensed private detective. Tom, I've got a problem. Could you look into it? I'll see you later. Hartman was also the founder and manager of the JFK Assassination Research Forum on CompuServe. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tom Hartman.
Thank you, George. I think this mic, there we go. Thank you very much. Thank you. In any murder investigation, the classic, perhaps cliche, is motive, means, and opportunity. And George Michael has done a marvelous job here this morning or this afternoon, I think, of presenting motive. Certainly, the Kennedys were in the process of taking apart the international drug business, or at least the United States portion of it, and the mafia, in particular the mob, the syndicate as it were, was under incredible, extreme pressure from them on all fronts. They were using the IRS for the first time, number of things. What I want to talk about are, going from motive, is to opportunity, and to a certain extent means, and then Lamar will summarize with a considerable amount of detail about the means, and in quick summary, what we're going to talk about is how these people used an existing Well, I'll get into the details of that as it goes along. First, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Kennedy brothers' plan to bring democracy to Cuba, using an operation that we call Project Freedom. Now, it may sound like Cuba's out there, and what are we talking about, the drug trade here? You will see where these intersect in a moment. I must emphasize that Project Freedom is our name for Kennedy's secret operation. Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover called it one thing, the CIA called it another, and the Navy probably had yet another name for it, and we're calling it Project Freedom because freedom for the Cuban people was the Kennedy brothers' ultimate goal with this. After I finish, Lamar will go into more detail about Project Freedom, expanding beyond the Vanity Fair article, which shared some of the details of that. He will give you a number of new details gleaned from our sources and declassified documents, many first publicly revealed this afternoon and in this forum, which will demonstrate how the Mafia successfully used their drug operations, specifically their heroin traffickers, to help in the murder of John Kennedy. Further, I'll be leaving immediately after my presentation. In this last week, I've flown from Vancouver to Frankfurt and back to Dallas, and I've got an 8 o'clock flight out of here tonight. So Lamar will be here to answer your questions, but that's only appropriate. He's the researcher in the team, and I'm the writer, and he's has a very good command of the facts here. Even on those occasions where I've traveled to other countries to do research for this book, spoken with government and military leaders, members of the Cuban resistance. We've tracked down professional killers for the Mafia, talked with former initiates, close friends, co-workers of John and Robert Kennedy. It's always been with Lamar, with Lamar's questions in hand, so I'll be leaving you in good hands. First, some background. Lamar and I have spent 6 years researching this issue and tracking down sources. We've interviewed several people close to John and Robert Kennedy who have never spoken before publicly on the record. Our effort began as an attempt to write a carefully researched book that would cover JFK's efforts to bring democracy to Cuba, especially his actions after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Kennedys' massive efforts against organized crime. These efforts went way beyond the well-publicized attacks against Jimmy Hoffa and extended all the way to powerful mob bosses like Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello. Over a 5-year period, we constructed a massive computerized database containing information about organized crime and Cuban operations, including Project Freedom, from hundreds of sources. To answer remaining questions, we approached people close to the actual events and who were close to John and Robert Kennedy. Since our book is being written in such a way that their identities and national security operations could be protected, and parenthetically, I'll note, we're writing this book as a novel, as a historically accurate novel rather than a nonfiction book, because we have come across so much information that can't be presented without endangering people and programs, that it really has to be presented this way. And with our assurance that that would be how it would be presented, a number of people were willing to cooperate with us in ways that frankly surprised us. Many of these people would love to have this on the record, but know why it cannot be, and you will too when we're finished here. Their help led to our discovery of documentary proof of Project Freedom from sources like the John F. Kennedy Library at the National Archives and the National Security Archives of the Brookings Institute. We were also able to go back to previously reviewed material like the Church Committee report and discover in references and footnotes confirmation of things we've been told in confidence by multiple off-the-record sources. Those footnotes had been overlooked by thousands of researchers, including us, over the years, because without knowledge of Project Freedom, nobody could understand the relevance of what would otherwise seem to be cryptic comments. Now that many more documents are being declassified, we're finding even more on-the-record documentation of Project Freedom, which Lamar will tell you about as soon as I'm finished. Our research has led us to conclude that Bobby Kennedy's suspicions, which he expressed to aides and friends before his death, were correct. The mob assassinated his brother. Mobsters learned in the summer and fall of 1963 of the Kennedys' plan to bring democracy to Cuba, what we call Project Freedom. Using their knowledge of Project Freedom, mob bosses Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello were able to kill JFK while forcing the government to cover up much of the evidence having to do with the assassination in order to protect the secrecy of Project Freedom and its innocent participants. As John Davis, Dan Moldea, Walter Sheridan, and others have documented, both JFK and Bobby knew of the danger that they were collectively facing from Jimmy Hoffa and the Mafia in mounting the biggest assault on organized crime, as George Michael has talked about here, that has ever been attempted in the United States history, and certainly larger than anything that has been even feebly attempted since then. But while they were fighting the mob on one front, on another front they were also trying to restore democracy to Cuba. And there, they knew that Fidel Castro, if he found out about their plans to overthrow him in 1963, that plan we call Project Freedom, might retaliate. This led them to create a still secret Cuba contingency plan for dealing with the possibility of Castro's retaliation. But JFK had not forgotten that the mob would use part of his Cuba plan, or hadn't foreseen rather, pardon me, that the mob would use part of his Cuba plans against him, first trying to assassinate him in November of 1963 in Chicago, then in Tampa, and finally, successfully, here in Dallas. Project Freedom was not just a CIA operation or a naval intelligence operation or an army operation. Those groups had important roles, but it was not controlled by any of those groups. This was Bobby Kennedy's own personal operation. After the disaster at the Bay of Pigs and the absurdly ineffective CIA mob plots, Bobby was not about to entrust such an important operation completely to the CIA. He was also concerned about secrecy, so much so that he had men responsible for implementing Project Freedom report directly to him without having to go through the traditional bureaucracy or government agencies that normally would intervene in such a process. Project Freedom involved most of the true leaders of the Bay of Pigs, including heroic fighters like Manuel Artime, Pepe San Marón, and who had large-scale bases in Central America ready for an amphibious assault on Cuba. It included Manuel Rey's group Hure, considered the most liberal of the exile groups, and as detailed in Bill Turner's Deadly Secrets, it included Eloy Minoyo, who was running a base of operations in the Dominican Republic. It included a small U.S. military contingent made up of trusted Cuban exiles based at Fort Benning, Georgia. And most importantly, it also, and this is the key, it also involved people in Cuba, people with a power base, officials in the government higher than Rolando Cubela. What was unique about Project Freedom and differentiated it from all other previous programs against Fidel Castro was that it was designed to assist these secret allies of the United States who were within the Cuban government, working for Castro but not loyal to him, in staging an internal coup. This coup then, and not some invasion by U.S. forces or some wild plan to have Castro's beard fall off or to kill him with exploding seashells, this coup would leave in place in the Cuban government friends of democracy, and thereby was, in Robert Kennedy's mind, the best possibility to bring about a truly democratic government for Cuba. After the coup, the new leaders of Cuba would ask for assistance in restoring order and rebuilding their democracy from the U.S. Exile leaders Artime, San Ramon, Rey, Minoyo would then land and help form a coalition government with a special force of Cuban-American soldiers stationed and trained at Fort Benning, specifically for this, providing support. Some people, upon hearing of the Kennedy brothers' secret plan to support an internal coup in Cuba, may assume that they were sanctioning the assassination of Fidel Castro, or that assassination was at the core of the operation. But our discussion with participants in Project Freedom and the documentary record, including an NSC planning memo of June 1963, show that Project Freedom was definitely not an assassination operation. This was altogether different from the CIA mob plots to assassinate Castro that the CIA had kept hidden from Bobby. For your reference, the actual National Security Council memorandum was kept classified for a long time, but a summary of it can be found in the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Volume 10, page 77. In Section 1, it says that the overthrow of the Castro communist regime must be accomplished by Cuban citizens, not Americans, inside and outside of Cuba working in concert. And Section 4, which says the U.S. government will deny any participation if the plan is ever discovered, helps to explain the secrecy surrounding Project Freedom. Keep in mind the milieu in which Jack and Robert Kennedy saw the need for Project Freedom. They had inherited, without realizing it at first, a series of ill-advised and often Keystone Cops-like CIA mob assassination plots against Castro, which were started by Richard Nixon. Nixon had escalated these to a fevered pitch in 1960 in an attempt to pull off an October surprise to throw the presidential election his way. His pressure on the agency and the involvement of the mafia led to a situation that the Kennedys, particularly Robert, found abhorrent, as well as lousy foreign policy. The Kennedys ordered them stopped and were told that they were stopped, although they were lied to, and the plots continued right through the time of JFK's assassination. To the Kennedys, Project Freedom was not an assassination plan. It was support for an already brewing coup, using people living within Cuba itself to bring democracy to that country. Bobby realized that assassinating Fidel Castro would only result in Raul or Che taking power, or possibly even another Batista-style dictatorship. But by working with Cubans who already had a power base in Cuba, and with Cuban exiles who enjoyed support among the exiles in America, the Kennedys believed that they could help forge a Cuban government that would have broad, popular, local support and lead to the first true democracy in the history of Cuba. In many ways, it would be similar to the U.S. today supporting a coup in Iraq by reformers inside Saddam's government and Iraqi exiles with the goal of eventually bringing a stable democracy to Iraq. If possible, JFK would have preferred a peaceful, negotiated resolution of the Cuban problem, and he was continuing to work on this angle by having William Atwood secretly negotiate with Fidel. But there was no way to be sure that those negotiations would yield a settlement, so he also approved this tough action against Fidel's government, this Project Freedom. JFK did not want Cuba to become another Vietnam. The 1964 campaign for the presidency was beginning, and the Republicans were already starting to beat JFK over the head with the Cuba issue. Nixon, who was leading JFK in the polls, as was Goldwater, had already made it clear to JFK that he, Nixon, would have committed U.S. forces at the Bay of Pigs. So a Republican victory in '64 meant to the Kennedys that a Vietnam-style conflict would happen just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Not wanting Cuba to become a political football during the campaign or to be faced with another Cuban Missile Crisis if evidence of Soviet or Chinese missiles surfaced, JFK felt that he had no choice but to take definitive action on Cuba soon, before the end of the year and the beginning of the 1964 campaign. A few more details about Project Freedom. First, it was totally separate from the A.M. Lash operation. The Church Report volume entitled Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders has a footnote on page 86 documenting a separate operation against Castro, which was going on at the same time as the A.M. Lash operation. It says this other plan involves using people within the Cuban government to essentially stage a coup. This is a reference to Project Freedom, which either the CIA or the Church Committee had made intentionally vague. There's another official reference to Project Freedom in Volume 5 of the Church Report on pages 30 and 31. It clearly shows that two operations against Cuba were halted on December 8th, A.M. Lash and one other, the one we call Project Freedom. It mentions a coup that Kennedy's CIA Director McCone knew about, but does not refer to A.M. Lash. That's because the A.M. Lash operation was kept partially hidden from McCone and Bobby Kennedy. The only coup that McCone and Kennedy were aware of was Project Freedom. The next paragraph in that volume of the Church Report deals with trying to get President Johnson to continue the operation. It's not referring to A.M. Lash, but to Project Freedom. Project Freedom was much more thoroughly planned and was much farther along than the A.M. Lash operation at the time of the death of JFK. Project Freedom was set to commence in late November or early December of 1963. And it actually stood a good chance of succeeding because the people in Cuba involved in Project Freedom had a much larger power base and constituency than did those involved in A.M. Lash. One of the questions many people ask is why and how Desmond Fitzgerald of the CIA could feel confident in pursuing the A.M. Lash operation without Bobby Kennedy's full knowledge and authorization. An examination of the record in light of this new knowledge of Project Freedom shows that Fitzgerald used the National Security Council's June of 1963 authorization for Project Freedom to indirectly self-authorize the A.M. Lash project. In other words, since he was following the basic outlines of Bobby's wishes to overthrow the Castro regime, he felt that he was legally justified, even if he didn't fully brief Bobby or the president. So Bobby and McCone remained unaware of the scope of the A.M. Lash operation. But when word of the A.M. Lash plan leaked out much later, those who worked with Bobby on Project Freedom felt that the CIA's Desmond Fitzgerald had observed both the spirit and the letter of this June 1963 directive of the NSC, and that this directive represented very much Bobby's wishes. Desmond Fitzgerald oversaw CIA operation for Project Freedom, in addition to running his own A.M. Lash operation. Contrary to some reports, Fitzgerald was not passing a poison pen to A.M. Lash in Paris when JFK was assassinated. Fitzgerald was in Washington, meeting with other CIA officials and Bobby's representatives about putting the final phase of Project Freedom into effect. Aside from sharing some of the same case officers, the only other thing in common between the A.M. Lash operation and Project Freedom was one thing: Santos Trafficante. According to recently declassified portions of the CIA Inspector General's report, Santos Trafficante had penetrated the A.M. Lash operation. Trafficante, one of the major heroin traffickers certainly in the United States, if not the world. And his close associate, Carlos Marcello, also managed to learn about Project Freedom and Bobby Kennedy's Cuban contingency plan for protecting Project Freedom. Bobby Kennedy and those reporting to him in the highest echelons of the tightly held Project Freedom tried very hard to make sure that the mob was not a part of or able to infiltrate Project Freedom in any way. But keep in mind that Project Freedom was only one part, although it was the most important part, of a large covert operation against Fidel on the part of the United States. Beginning under Vice President Nixon in 1960, according to Dan Moldea back in 1959, mobsters had been working for the CIA to help them against Fidel. But unknown to Bobby Kennedy, some of these mobsters, who were, incidentally, loyal to Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello, maintained unofficial connections to CIA operatives in the summer and fall of 1963. For instance, Johnny Roselli was supposedly released from the CIA assassination plots in January of '63. But according to Bradley Ayer's book, The War That Never Was, and Gaten Fonzie's book, The Last Investigation, personal contacts allowed Roselli access to CIA officials in Miami throughout the summer and fall of 1963. Recently released CIA documents show Roselli remaining friendly with CIA agents for more than a year after the assassination of John Kennedy. Trafficante and Carlos Marcello used Johnny Roselli's knowledge of Project Freedom and their other CIA operations to cover up the true story of how they killed JFK. A second and vitally important component of Project Freedom was the Cuba Contingency Plan. Contingency plans began to be made in September of 1963 for what to do if Fidel or his sympathizers learned about Project Freedom and decided to retaliate against the United States. These plans were detailed in Volume 5 of the Church Report, beginning on page 15. In addition to other forms of retaliation, the Kennedys and the National Security Council considered the possibility that Fidel might even order the assassination of U.S. public officials. The Cuba Contingency Plan was intended to buy time for the Kennedy administration, in the event that Fidel was successful in such an effort, to determine carefully how they would react publicly. Though the plans for September and early October were discussed in the Church Report, the report is silent as to any of the details that the plan actually included and about the planning that continued in November of 1963. One heavily censured document was declassified in 1980, however, after the House Select Committee had finished its work. It's dated November 12, 1963, and it shows that just 10 days before JFK's death, the U.S. government was making contingency plans for what to do if a U.S. official was assassinated by Castro's agents because of Project Freedom. The Cuba Contingency Plan was mainly directed at the possibility of Fidel or his sympathizers having a U.S. ambassador assassinated, presumably in a Latin American country. This was the assumption. They figured this is probably what he would do if he was going to try to strike back at us. In that case, the President and the National Security Council would need time to plan a reasoned response without being subject to the intense pressure from the U.S. press, Nixon, or partisan reactionaries in Congress. For instance, JFK wouldn't want to order quick retaliatory strikes against Cuba, only to find out later that Fidel really wasn't behind the death of that particular U.S. ambassador. Imagine you're JFK. You've just gotten word that the U.S. ambassador to Panama, for example, has been assassinated, and the initial evidence points to it being a Cuban agent who assassinated him. Imagine what you'd need in order to have the time and information necessary to make the right decision about what to do and what to tell the American people. Remember, being rushed into making the wrong decision could start World War III. You'd want plans for controlling press coverage of the assassination, making sure explosive details or rumors about the killing were not publicized widely or wildly. You'd want military control of the autopsy regardless of the wishes of local officials. A naval base would be preferable because of the Navy's role in your Cuba plans, and also because, if you're John Kennedy, you can trust the Navy, that branch of service, because you're a former member of it. You have good connections to it. You'd want federal agencies to seize control of the evidence and the investigation as quickly as possible, though they'd have to do this carefully to avoid ruffling local feathers and avoid the appearance of a cover-up. You'd basically want whatever steps were needed to buy time for the President and the National Security Council to make the best decision possible about how to respond. What else did the Cuba Contingency Plan include? Well, according to a 1976 article by award-winning reporter Ted Salt, I'm mispronouncing that, am I not?
Tad Schultz.
Tad Schultz, thank you. The There was a task force consisting of representatives of the FBI, CIA, and others designed to investigate possible incidents of retaliation by Fidel and report directly to Bobby Kennedy. Report directly to Bobby Kennedy. These contingency plans were actually used to quash press coverage of assassination attempts against JFK in Chicago on November 1st of 1963, because the mob, now knowing about the Cuba Contingency Plan and Project Freedom, made sure that local and federal officials believed that a Cuban agent of Castro's was in the area at the time. There's a memo in the AARC files where several Chicago newsmen discussed the threat. Quote, 4 men who planned an assassination attempt, but they were seized but apparently not arrested. A disassembled rifle was found. Unquote. And the fact that there was no press coverage of it at this time. The HSCA looked into this attempt, and we've investigated more and are convinced that this was an attempt planned by Trafficante and Marcello on JFK's life, involving some of the same people who eventually killed him in Dallas 5 days later. This is separate from the well-documented Valier arrest, which was reported because there was no apparent Castro-Cuban connection associated with it. The Cuba Contingency Plan was also put into effect in Tampa on November 18th, 1963. Again, it was implemented. Like Chicago, the mob had made sure that there were indications that Cuban agents were involved in Tampa, which had a very active Fair Play for Cuba committee chapter. The 2 articles which detailed the threat did not appear until a week after JFK's visit, when he was dead. There was virtually no press coverage of the threat at that time. The article published after JFK's death says that the FBI, the Secret Service, and local police all refused to discuss the matter with UPI. Not exactly a good way to get the word out for a suspect when you're expecting an assassination attempt, but it is consistent with the aims of the Cuba Contingency Plan. In the Tampa case, by the way, a description was issued prior to JFK's motorcade. The suspect was white, male, slender build, in his 20s, virtually identical to the one issued in Dallas right after JFK was assassinated. Just to be clear, the 53-year-old banker mentioned in the articles had nothing to do with the assassination threat, which involved 2 others, if you track those down. In one of the articles, Tampa Police Chief Mullen says he doesn't know, quote, if the other 2 may have followed the presidential caravan to Dallas, end quote. Reporter Seth Cantor learned that a close associate of the 2 men did indeed go to Texas. Their associate, according to Cantor, just happened to be a Fair Play for Cuba committee member, which would, of course, ring loud bells for anyone charged with implementing the Cuba Contingency Plan and protecting the security of the United States. Also, the Tampa area motorcade was one of the longest of JFK's presidency, perfect for an assassination. It even had a sharp 90-degree turn in front of a huge unsecured building with lots of windows, very similar to Dallas. Like other stops on his Florida tour, Tampa involved a visit to a military base, which is important because JFK knew that military forces stationed in Florida might be called upon to support Project Freedom, which would be implemented in the coming weeks. As for why the attempt on JFK's life was not carried through in Tampa, it's possible it was canceled because word of the threat leaked out, as borne out by newspaper articles we saw published after the event. Also, there were last-minute changes in the motorcade route that might have caused timing problems. And it's highly possible that the ever-cautious Trafficante simply preferred that the hit take place somewhere other than his own home turf. JFK was certainly aware of the rumors of threats against his life, yet he continued with his Florida tour, going on to Miami for a speech that same day. Remember, JFK and Bobby had known since the fall of 1962 that Jimmy Hoffa's mobsters had been trying to kill Bobby, but they had not let that stop their prosecution of Hoffa. And JFK would not be stopped now, because he had a very important speech to give in Miami that day. It was the speech that would signal the leaders of the coup in Cuba that they had the support of the President of the United States and that the U.S.-based operatives of Project Freedom were now ready to act immediately. JFK's Miami speech was reported in the Dallas Times-Herald the following day. You can find it in Commission Exhibit number 2695 with the headline, quote, "Kennedy virtually invites Cuban coup," end quote. Some people have said his Miami speech was intended for A.M. Lash. In actuality, it was a signal to his Project Freedom allies inside the Cuban government that he would support their actions. That this speech was intended as a signal to the coup leaders in Cuba is further verified by a footnote from page 20 of volume 5 of the Church report, where it refers to JFK's speech that day as an example of the kind of statement that new President Lyndon Johnson should make to the Project Freedom people in Cuba if he wanted the plan to continue. Just 4 days after JFK's Miami speech to his Project Freedom allies in Cuba, however, he was dead. And parts of his Cuba contingency plan wound up being applied to his own assassination. This explains explains many of the peculiarities surrounding the medical evidence and Robert Kennedy's and the government's handling of the investigation of JFK's assassination. We know now that mob bosses Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello had learned of the Cuba contingency plans through their contacts in the CIA. They did this using contacts developed 3 years earlier when Vice President Nixon's push for an October election surprise in Cuba resulted in the CIA enlisting mobsters like Trafficante to assassinate Fidel Castro. Trafficante and Marcello used their knowledge of the Cuba contingency plan to force the government of the United States to hide the mafia's involvement in the JFK assassination. As long as the mob's patsy had Cuban connections, like Oswald did, and there were reports of Cuban agent activity in the area, official Cuban agent in the area, they knew that the government and Bobby Kennedy would be forced into a certain response, dictated by the Cuba contingency plan. Blaming the JFK killing on Castro or a Castro agent may also cause the U.S. government to invade Cuba in retaliation. This would be very helpful to Trafficante and Marcello. First of all, because it would take the focus of the government and the American people away from the assassination, and secondly, they may have even ended up with another government down there in Cuba sympathetic to them, as was Batista. They might have gone back into the casino business. It may also have been an added incentive thrown like a bone by Trafficante and Marcello to the mob's few low-level intelligence contacts within the government to help in the Kennedy killing, because they also wanted to see Castro overthrown. We can tell you now that one of the low-level CIA operatives assigned to Project Freedom was, according to official government reports, fired from the CIA for his contacts with organized crime in Florida. This happened after the JFK assassination, and we've discovered that the Florida organized crime contacts of this particular CIA's agents did involve dealings with Santos Trafficante. Is there documentation that Trafficante and Marcello or their associates knew about Project Freedom? Is there documentation? John Martino, who was Johnny Roselli's roommate in 1963, tells us so in Warren Commission Exhibit number 657. Even as the Warren Commission was holding hearings in February of 1964, Trafficante's man, John Martino, taunted the FBI with his knowledge of JFK's secret plan to eliminate Castro's rule over Cuba, his knowledge of Project Freedom. In fact, according to Bill Turner's Deadly Secrets, book Deadly Secrets, Martino began spreading the word that Castro was behind the assassination just 3 days after Kennedy was shot. And he continued to do so in speeches and articles for months to come. This kept the pressure on the government to keep the Cuba contingency plan in place and to limit certain aspects of the investigation and to steer the Warren Commission in the direction they took. This included limiting the investigation of John Martino, as Warren Commission memos to J. Lee Rankin reproduced in the HSCA volumes show as well. It all comes back to Trafficante. As in a 1959 FBI memo connecting Martino to Trafficante and the notorious Rolando Masferrer shows, and as Earl Goltz documented in 1978, and as reported in Tony Summers' Vanity Fair article, John Martino knew many details of the assassination, including the fact that there was more than one shooter and that Oswald was supposed to meet his contact at the Texas Theater. When we talk about the mob here, and the dozen or so people knowingly involved in the assassination, our definition of organized crime is not limited to the mafia. As Peter Dale Scott points out in Deep Politics, the classic Sicilian mafia depicted in movies like The Godfather presents only one aspect of organized crime. As the term applies to the JFK assassination, organized crime includes many nationalities and ethnic groups ranging from the Jewish Jack Ruby to French connection heroin traffickers to corrupt teamsters with mob ties to intelligence operatives who work for U.S. agencies while also making even more money from organized crime. These people have worked together in their secure networks profitably for decades. It was Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante who had JFK killed. Back in 1963, on the evening of the assassination, Trafficante celebrated JFK's death with his attorney Frank Regano at the International Inn restaurant in Tampa. Ironically, JFK had given a speech at that very same hotel during his visit to Tampa just a few days earlier. For Trafficante, the irony must have been sweet. JFK and Bobby had engaged in a massive crackdown on organized crime figures. On a personal level, Santos Trafficante and Carlos Marcello had been feeling intense pressure. By fall of 1963, Marcello had been subjected to a humiliating deportation, had illegally returned, and had to resort to bribing a juror to remain out of jail. Both Marcello and Trafficante stood to lose millions of dollars in pension fund loans due to Hoffa's ongoing trial. Trafficante's gambling operations had become the target of IRS busts, resulting in huge IRS liens. And in a final unbearable insult, Trafficante's own wife had been subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. Senate testimony in October 1963 about Trafficante's operations received far too much publicity to suit Trafficante. And even his highly profitable and generally secure heroin ring was feeling the pinch with the major bust of a French associate on October 12, 1963 in Texas. Both men, Trafficante and Marcello, saw the debilitating lockstep surveillance that Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana was being subjected to, and they knew that a similar treatment for them would be a disaster, and that it could be applied to them at any moment, as long as JFK remained alive to support his brother's tough actions. Another way the mob infiltrated the CIA's Cuban operations was through CIA agent Q.J. Wynn, a French connection heroin smuggler associated with Trafficante. Q.J. Wynn had worked as an assassin and recruiter for the CIA since at least the fall of 1960. Later, the CIA admits they had him apply his talents to the Cuban part of their ZR rifle assassination program. Q.J. Wynn was in deep to Trafficante as the result of a 1962 bust of one of Q.J. Wynn's heroin shipments. Plus, his mob earnings were many times that of a CIA paycheck. Q.J. Wynn was deported from Dallas hours after the assassination, as verified by both INS officials and an FBI memo. In addition to infiltrating CIA operations, Marcello and Trafficante made attempts, both successful and unsuccessful, to infiltrate Project Freedom directly. For example, Manuel Artimi, the former leader of the Bay of Pigs, was an insider in Project Freedom. His Cuban exile associates in New Orleans, however, had contact with two men who worked for Carlos Marcello. Their names were Guy Bannister and David Ferry. Rolando Masferrer, a notorious Cuban death squad leader who did jobs for Trafficante and who worked with John Martino, tried to bluff his way into Project Freedom almost as soon as it began with the help of two gangsters. He was unsuccessful. Masferrer was enraged at the rejection and, we were told by a source within Project Freedom, threatened the life to this man's face of one of Project Freedom's leaders because they would not let him into the operation. In September of 1963, Masferrer made another attempt to infiltrate and compromise Project Freedom. Masferrer knew that Manuel Rey and Rey's organization, Jorge, was part of Project Freedom. So working with John Martino, we believe he arranged a provocative visit to the home of Sylvia Odio, the daughter of a prominent Jorge member. Martino told associates he was going to Dallas to sell arms to Odio in September. I would like to correct something we speculated about at the Ask conference last year, and just make a small factual correction here. In a year of digging and getting feedback from dozens of you, it's the only correction, frankly, that we've had to make to last year's talk, those of you who've seen it or heard it. Sylvia Odio said in interviews that he had wanted to buy arms from Johnny Martin. There was a Juan B. Martin interviewed with the FBI, detailed an incredibly brief document, but he seemed not to be the person involved. We speculated that the Johnny Martin she referred to was John Martino. However, we have confirmed that this was not the case, that Sylvia Odio did not personally know John Martino, but he knew of her, and that was all that was required. However, that in no way changes our view that Martino, who acknowledged wanting to visit Odio in September of '63, was involved in the Odio incident. Sylvia Odio came to Martino and Rolando Masferrer's attention because she lived close to one of Masferrer's relatives. Lamar will have more information we've recently uncovered about Masferrer's links to Project Freedom. But back to the assassination and its subsequent cover-up. The mob was able to keep their involvement in the assassination secret in three ways. First, they used trusted assassins who'd pulled off successful hits many times in the past. These professional killers were experienced in both execution and evading arrest. They also brought in some of the most ruthless members of Marcello and Trafficante's heroin operation. This heroin operation was their absolutely most secure, most profitable, and most lethal operation. Second was their choice of patsies. The mob made sure that their patsies for the assassination had obvious Cuban connections, either through affiliation with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, as 3 patsies did, or by Cuban nationality, as 2 patsies did, as well as legitimate U.S. intelligence contacts. They wanted their patsies to have these contacts. The Cuban connection would ensure that Bobby's contingency plan would go into effect and hopefully provoke an attack on Cuba, which would preclude a quick, thorough investigation. The intelligence contacts of the patsy would ensure additional cover-ups by U.S. intelligence agencies trying to cover up. Finally, almost all of the dozen or so people knowingly involved in the assassination had government protection at one time or another, because they had acted as informers or performed services for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. In our opinion, this was one of Trafficante and Marcello's criteria when they selected their participants. For example, even the FBI admits that Ruby was an informer for them. Roselli had worked for the CIA for almost 3 years at the time of JFK's death. The CIA even managed to keep Trafficante's role in the CIA mob plots prior to JFK's assassination secret for almost 12 years after the assassination. After JFK was killed, there was and continues to be a massive cover-up because the mob made sure that the Cuba contingency plan was activated by laying clues indicating that Fidel Castro was behind JFK's death. And as additional protection, the mob made sure there could not be a full government investigation without exposing Project Freedom, which, if done incorrectly, could have led to the deaths or imprisonment of the coup plotters within the Cuban government who remained, or so the government believed, and perhaps accurately, loyal to the U.S. and to the idea of democracy for Cuba. The resulting cover-up by the government did protect Project Freedom, as it was intended to do, but it also obscured Marcello and Trafficante's responsibility for JFK's assassination. The entire apparatus of the United States government, including Bobby Kennedy, Earl Warren, and every president since LBJ, has had no choice. Exposure of Project Freedom could not only tarnish JFK's legacy, but in the tense Cold War times of 1963, it could have touched off a nuclear war. In 1963, it definitely would have caused the deaths of those associated with Project Freedom who were still in Cuba. Even today, there are surviving family members and close associates of the Cuban officials who are working with the Kennedys on Project Freedom in Cuba, whose lives could be in danger if the details of Project Freedom were exposed. Finally, exposing Project Freedom back in 1963 would have ended any hope the U.S. had of ever bringing democracy to Cuba. This was their best shot. So Project Freedom is still a secret operation, which is why we cannot give you some of the actual names of the people involved or the actual code name of the project itself. To do so, we must confront the same legal and moral dilemma that our government is, which is why our book will be written as a novel. Until Fidel Castro is no longer in power, it may compromise the national security of the United States to divulge the details of it beyond what we've told you here today, much of which can be gleaned from the public record. So you can see that most of what's been called the cover-up wasn't designed to protect those who killed JFK. It was done to protect Project Freedom. Because information about Project Freedom has been denied to government investigators like the Warren Commission, the Rockefeller Commission, and the House Select Committee, as well as all the major news organizations and many noted authors, the story of JFK's assassination has never before been fully documented. But there have been many cracks in this wall. Most of you know about the loyal Kennedy aides Kenny Donnell and Dave Powers, who were riding the car directly behind Kennedy's, and both saw shots fired from the front, from the grassy knoll. These were 2 of JFK's most trusted aides, and Bobby had been friends with each man for decades. The report that they claimed to see shots fired from the grassy knoll first surfaced in the Chicago Tribune article in 1975, along with the fact that the FBI pressured both men to alter their Warren Commission testimony in order to protect the national security. The national security that was at stake was Project Freedom. Keep in mind when considering what went on at that autopsy that it's inconceivable that Kenny O'Donnell wouldn't have shared this information about the shots that he saw from the front with his close friend Robert Kennedy. And as we now know, Robert Kennedy supervised the autopsy, even though he was several floors above it. Additionally, the House Select Committee indicated that JFK was probably killed as the result of conspiracy, and indicated that the Mafia, specifically Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, were the most likely suspects. Our research and sources helped us reach the same conclusion, only with additional information that was not available to the House Select Committee. Naval Intelligence, for example, in a still secret report, which was not made available to the House Select Committee, though it is referred to in their report, had done their own investigation of the JFK assassination. You will find reference to this in HSCA Volume 11, pages 539 to 551. Using the House Select Committee information on the Navy report as a starting point, my co-author, Lamar Waldron, tracked down and obtained information from two independent and confidential sources associated with that naval intelligence investigation. In spite of stonewalling by the Navy, the HSCA found persuasive evidence that the naval intelligence investigation had concluded, quote, Oswald was incapable of having committed the assassination alone, end of quote. According to our more extensive reports, Naval Intelligence had concluded that ex-Marine Lee Oswald was also incapable of masterminding the assassination or of doing the actual shooting. The Naval Intelligence investigators had access to hundreds of documents and dozens of interviews largely withheld from both the Warren Commission and the later HSCA. And Naval Intelligence had Oswald under tight surveillance from the time of his return from his, quote, defection, end quote, to the USSR. ONI was hoping, the reason they were watching Oswald, they were hoping that the KGB would try to contact Oswald or his wife at some point, thus giving our side insight into how the KGB recruited agents. Since Naval Intelligence had limited resources for a tight day-to-day surveillance of Oswald or anybody else, they utilized the FBI and the CIA in helping them carry out that surveillance. This explains the many people with intelligence or informant backgrounds who seemed to constantly swirl around Oswald. ONI had additional surveillance material on Oswald in Mexico City, including photographs, not necessarily of Oswald at communist embassies, which have never been made public. The Naval Intelligence investigation of the assassination began on the afternoon of the day Oswald was killed. Prior to that, on the day of JFK's assassination, some of the Naval Intelligence material was destroyed and other materials were sanitized. This was so sensitive that information could not be given to defense lawyers or government investigating agencies. It was also done to protect the identities of other, quote, defectors, end quote, in the same surveillance program as Oswald, as well as the identities of the FBI, CIA, and Naval Intelligence informers who were reporting Oswald's movements. This destruction of documents may have served also to protect, from their point of view, the Navy's reputation, but it has contributed, unfortunately, to the lingering questions surrounding Oswald's Mexico City conduct. This also helps explain how some people could think that the CIA was involved in the assassination because of their 30 years of protecting documents and information. The CIA covered up certain blunders and unauthorized missions, but as an agency, they didn't kill JFK. There are a handful of intelligence agents whom testimony or documentation we have indicates were involved in the assassination, but they were relatively low level. They were relatively low-level CIA operatives who even the CIA at various times has since acknowledged had ties to organized crime and the narcotics traffic, and specifically to Carlos Marcello and Santos Trafficante. While we cannot rule out the possibility that a small number of mid-level intelligence agents were involved in the assassination, there's really not enough evidence to prove that any of them were specifically involved, because many of their seemingly suspicious actions can be explained by their involvement in either the naval intelligence surveillance of Oswald or by their activities related to Project Freedom, or by their covering up of operations against Castro that hadn't received full authorization from CIA Director John McCone or the Kennedys. We have confirmed that the CIA was pursuing certain assassination operations of their own without the full authorization and knowledge of Robert Kennedy. The CIA was carrying out so many authorized operations against Castro, as John Newman is amply documenting, the number is many times larger than anyone had ever imagined, that it is relatively easy for them to slip in at least a couple of deadly unauthorized operations. And as we've seen with the recent Aldrich Ames scandal, people in the CIA will go to extreme lengths to protect each other and the reputation of the agency. Anti-Castro Cubans as a group have gotten a very undeserved bad reputation also in regard to the CIA assassination. Many Cuban Americans have performed courageous acts of heroism, both at the Bay of Pigs and later, and never received proper recognition. For example, several Bay of Pigs leaders and many of their followers were actively working with RFK to make Project Freedom a reality. But because of the secrecy surrounding Project Freedom, their heroic efforts have never been properly documented. So the theory that anti-Castro Cubans killed JFK because they were angry over the Bay of Pigs is a gross oversimplification of a complex issue and is simply not correct. There were several anti-Castro groups angry at JFK in 1963, certainly, but they were angry over being left out of Project Freedom and having their unauthorized activities banned. It is really a monumental testimony to the quality of Robert Kennedy's planning and the loyalty of those who worked for him that information about Project Freedom has only leaked out in the most peripheral way all these years. Contrary to the bumbling CIA view held by many people, in fact, the national security apparatus of the U.S. government does function most of the time as it is supposed to. One demonstration of the government's ability to keep a secret comes from Robert Kennedy's own words. He had helped plan and run Project Freedom, and he also helped in drafting the Cuba Contingency Plan, and he knew that revealing the truth of his brother's killers would bring Project Freedom to light with possibly disastrous results to the national security. But in private, according to author John Davis, Bobby voiced suspicions about mafia involvement, especially Carlos Marcello, in his brother's death to several associates, including his former press secretary Frank Mankiewicz and aide Richard Goodwin. Bobby's aide Adam Walensky and Bobby's friend and biographer Jack Newfield also support the belief that Marcello and Trafficante were behind the killing of JFK. We're certain that Fidel Castro wasn't involved in JFK's assassination as well. RFK had formed a group to specifically guard against and investigate this possibility prior to JFK's death. The supposed links to Fidel were just too clumsy and contrived. RFK was so sure that Fidel had not learned of Project Freedom that he wanted it, as well as Atwood's secret peace initiatives, to continue in December of 1963 after the assassination. Bobby saw bringing democracy to Cuba as the perfect memorial to JFK, but LBJ did not share those feelings. As Peter Dale Scott and others have pointed out, LBJ's interests were in Vietnam, not in Cuba. Bobby's suspicions, as verified by his aides like Richard Goodwin, were that the mafia was behind his brother's death. If Fidel had wanted to kill JFK politically, he could easily have crippled the president by simply exposing the secret negotiations that were ongoing through Atwood. Or if he knew about Project Freedom, he could have exposed that and crippled the Kennedy administration. Plus, the longer Fidel dragged out the negotiations, and the more evidence Fidel had of them as a result of it, the stronger his position would become. So there may have been Cuban connections, but not to Fidel. As in any political organization, there are several factions within the Cuban government. As reported in Tony Summers' Conspiracy, in the fall of 1963, Fidel thought Cuba was becoming too dependent on Russia, and he was at odds with the international communist types in his government, like Che. Even Fidel told JFK through Atwood that Raul and Che must not find out about his negotiations with JFK. Instead, the available evidence indicates that any Cuban activity related to JFK's assassination was directed by the mafia, who still had influence in Cuba through Santos Trafficante and the French Corsican mob. Trafficante handled all of his drug dealings in Cuba through intermediaries. The only high government official Trafficante ever admitted talking to or receiving help from was Raul Castro. Intelligence reports say, quote, 2 gangsters, end quote, did fly into Cuba right after the assassination, and they probably had protection from someone in the Cuban government. However, since the U.S. and French mafia ran drugs through Cuba, the arrival of these gangsters may have just been business as usual and seen that way by Cuban officials. Also, a Cuban agent intensely loyal to Raul Castro, a young man named Miguel Casas Seis, was in the U.S. in October and November of 1963. This agent was near Chicago when the plot against JFK was uncovered there on November 1st of 1963. He was in Florida when there was a threat against JFK's life in Tampa on November 18th of 1963. And he was in Dallas at the time of JFK's assassination. He returned to Cuba via Mexico City. However, he was most probably being manipulated by the mafia. Seis first entered the U.S. in Puerto Rico, which was a major step in the mafia's Cuban cocaine smuggling route, and which also was the home base of Frank Chavez, a Teamster Mafia associate of Jack Ruby. Chavez was fingered in JFK's assassination by a Teamster associate the day it happened, And the record shows he later tried to assassinate Bobby twice, in 1964 and 1967. So there's no reason to think that either the Cuban agent Sayce or his mentor in Cuba knew anything about the assassination. It's more likely he was being manipulated by the mob as a possible patsy in case one of their Fair Play for Cuba member patsies wasn't enough. And of course his presence there triggered the Cuba Contingency Plan, knowledge of his presence there. LBJ, however, initially believed Fidel was behind JFK's assassination. But keep in mind, LBJ had been excluded from JFK's and Bobby's planning for Project Freedom. He didn't know about it. There's reason to believe that Bobby did not tell his hated rival of all of the details of Project Freedom even after LBJ became president, both because LBJ decided not to continue it and to ensure that LBJ could not use the failure of Project Freedom against Bobby if Bobby decided to challenge LBJ for the presidential nomination in 1964. So LBJ formed his conclusion without having all the facts about the Mafia and Project Freedom that Bobby had, and he used that conclusion to maintain the Cuba Contingency Plan in place and badger his friend Earl Warren into overlooking or obscuring evidence that LBJ feared might point the American public to a Cuban conspiracy. And so it stands today. A small group of men, professional killers all, under incredible pressure from the Kennedy administration, planned and executed the murder of JFK. They did it in such a way that people who had nothing to do with it, nothing to do with the assassination, who had no knowledge of it, would be forced for decades to cover up their actions. In a way that would falsely point the finger of suspicion at the CIA, FBI, ONI, and other agencies who were either tried to hide their previous associations with the patsies, or who were correctly and honorably trying to keep Project Freedom and the Cuba Contingency Plan secret. For these same reasons, as I mentioned, our book shall be written in a way that conveys this information, but does not endanger the national security. So, we believe this is the only way, frankly, that we can convey the story and protect the good guys, because they're still out there. So at this point, I'll turn it over to George Michael to, are we going to take a break? Should I call the break? Okay. We'll take a, thank you. We're going to take a real quick 10-minute bathroom break here, and then Lamar is going to share with you a whole bunch of neat new stuff.
Also remember that you're going to have very little time to get to our bookmark before it closes this evening. So if you remember that, check in with them.
I had a stage brought out from behind the Iron Curtain at the request of people in Washington Extreme. No, Spring Shepherd. Part of what he outlined that I wrote to him.
Yet unnamed book.
But it was how can you carry a writing without nobody saying anything about it? Now, all this is documented to me. I'm not trying to do no shuck job. In Christmas 1961. At Buckingham Palace, before I came back, and I contributed money for Oswald to write his diary on the way home.
Yes.
And so that's what I plan on using.
Thank you.
What I want
Lamar
from Oswald is time to write.
We'll be really happy that there's a copy of this right here,
In 1982,
so I can
after
show him what he asked me
1980,
for, because I couldn't find it.
You should have asked. They said, the judge told me, I don't care what you do down in Virginia, you're not going to write on this shit. So possibly, looked like I was writing Project Freedom without writing.
No, I know what he's looking for.
But it's